Hello, my friends. This is a big news day for two reasons. The first one is this: the jury has reached a verdict in the Trump hush money case. Now, here's the thing: they haven't reported it yet. Before, as I was putting this together, they hadn't even reached a verdict yet. And so it was about a day's worth of deliberating. So we'll find out what happens shortly. But I can't tell you right now. I'll circle back before the end of the video to see if anything has changed. But for right now, they have come to their conclusion, but they have not reported on it. Okay. In other news, NATO is meeting as pressure grows to let Ukraine hit Russia. NATO foreign ministers met in Prague on Thursday. The two-day gathering in the Czech capital is meant to focus on efforts to hammer out a package of support for Ukraine at NATO's summit in Washington in July. So they're working this out before that big summit. Now, if I was a betting man, I would say tonight, watch for lots of rockets, missiles, rockets, whatever, drones being fired into Ukraine. And there's a second reason for this, but the first reason is whenever there's like a NATO meeting or some kind of UN big meeting or something about Ukraine, Putin tends to fire lots of missiles in Ukraine to show his displeasure. The White House said it's still opposed to using U.S. arms to strike inside Russia, although Secretary of State Anthony Blinken hinted that the strategy could change. Meanwhile, Moscow has reacted strongly, with President Vladimir Putin warning there would be serious consequences if Western countries give approval to Ukraine. I can't imagine what the serious consequences could be because they can't use the nuclear weapons. NATO Chief Stoltenberg instead wants to get alliance members to make a clear multi-year commitments on how much aid they'll give Ukraine in the future. Then they can plan. You can't go forward with a counteroffensive if you can't plan on other, artillery and machinery and vehicles and other things actually being there to backfill those that you use up. So this is a good move forward. Proponents say making the alliance overall responsible could help insulate future deliveries against a possible return of Donald Trump to the U.S. presidency. So they're trying to move NATO to a more Eurocentric NATO rather than an American-led NATO, at least in the short term, so that they can brace against that possibility. And I think that's probably a very good move. This morning I talked about this. Somebody said 8-1. I saw that something 8-1 in casualties. I was not talking about casualties. I was talking about equipment losses here. This is Andrew Perpetua's. Here's Ukraine. Here is Russian losses. And this is about like drones hitting tanks and vehicles and things along those lines. If I was unclear, I apologize. Okay, let's move on to the next story. Biden getting closer to lifting the ban on Ukrainian strikes with American weapons on Russian territory, according to the New York Times. And this is an Interfax. Joe Biden is moving closer to lifting his ban. Now, after months of complaints about the restrictions from Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, the White House has begun a formal, apparently rapid, reassessment of whether to take the risk. Again, it's a risk because they're worried about escalation and their knee-jerk response is to not escalate. But if the president does change his view, it will most likely come with severe restrictions on how Ukrainians could use American-provided arms, limiting them to military targets just inside Russia's border that are involved in attacks on Ukraine. And of course, to military targets, they're not going to hit hotels when they can hit military targets anyway. That's the way the Ukrainians roll. Okay. Anthony Blinken said that the U.S. could adapt and adjust its position on Western weapons strikes against targets on Russian territory. Another hallmark of our support for Ukraine over these now more than 2 years has been to adapt. As the conditions have changed, we've adapted and adjusted too. When asked by a reporter whether Blinken's words meant that America could support Ukraine's attacks inside Russia, he replied, adapt and adjust means just that. So it's still vague, but we'll see how that all plays out. Now, in the meantime, the Russians aren't happy about this. Here's Pravda, Russian state paper. USA, it's up to Ukraine to decide where to strike Russia. Okay, and then they go down here and they say 10 Western countries, the UK, Latvia, Lithuania, Netherlands, Poland, Finland, France, Czech Republic, Sweden, and Estonia authorized Kyiv to launch missile strikes on Russian territory with the use of Western weapons. Well, so there's 10. Well, actually, as of this morning, there was 11. Denmark, premier, gives Ukraine green light to strike inside Russia with Danish weapons. Okay, that makes 11. But actually, wait, there's more. Now, the Washington Post this morning was citing sources reporting that the United States has allowed Ukraine to use Patriot surface to air missile systems on the Russian territory. Additionally, they will permit the interception of Russian Air Force aircraft in Russia using F 16s. But this wasn't formalized, at least not yet. I put this out earlier in the day. Let Ukraine strike back, let Ukraine strike back, let Ukraine strike back. And then I saw this. Joe Biden partially lifts ban. This was like a little over an hour ago. I put out a short video just saying, hey, this is what happened. Joe Biden partially lifts ban on Ukraine using U.S. weapons in strikes on Russian territory. And so it has happened. Now, these are a partial lift of the ban. It's not fully. Joe Biden has partially lifted the ban on Ukraine using American weapons. The change in American policy is understood to apply only to defend the area of Kharkiv, according to the reports. So it's because of the assault on Kharkiv that he's changed his mind. Okay, this is a breaking news story, and that was in Sky News. Here it is in military news, saying the same thing, but it was first reported in Politico, so I chased down the Politico article, and here we are. Biden secretly gave permission to strike inside Russia with U.S. weapons. The Biden administration has quietly given Ukraine permission to strike inside Russia solely near the area of Kharkiv. So it's not changed the policy broadly, but just for this one little area. And so we'll see if that, and I don't think it can be too long before the gloves are off with that and it becomes a broad policy. The U.S. made the decision to allow Ukraine flexibility to defend itself from attacks on the border near Kharkiv. And that's important because like the Russians can drop glide bombs and then just get away with impunity. And yeah, okay. It's a stunning shift in the administration. The administration initially said would escalate the war more directly, involving the U.S. in the fight, but worsening conditions for Ukraine on the battlefield, namely advances and improved position in Kharkiv, led the president to change his mind. Okay, so that's what's going on there. So I was going to show this article before what just happened. And it's a great article by Adam Kinzinger. He's a former congressman from Illinois, and Ben Hodges, a former commanding general of U.S. Army Europe. There seems to be a doctrine within the National Security Council in the Biden administration: escalation aversion. These escalationists seem deeply worried that any increase in support for Ukraine could lead to World War III. Like, that's what you hear, particularly from the Republican side of the aisle. Oh no, we don't want to create World War III. If you give them this, what's going to happen? And Putin seems to be pushing the same narrative. Let's revisit some of the history of the last couple of years. Ukraine requested javelins and stingers before the full-scale war began, when Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. Initially, they didn't receive the large quantities they wanted amid fears of escalation, and eventually they received them, but no nuclear war occurred. After the Battle of Kyiv was won, Ukraine requested MiG-29s. The Biden administration blocked this initially, but later relented. No nuclear war occurred. Ukraine requested F-16 fighter jets. The administration initially said no, and then changed its stance, and no nuclear war occurred. Ukraine requested Patriot missiles to defend against relentless Russian air attacks. The administration initially said no, again changed its stance, no nuclear war occurred. Ukraine requested HIMARS rocket launchers. The administration initially said no, no nuclear war occurred. Ukraine requested Abrams tanks and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. The administration initially said no, no nuclear war occurred. Ukraine requested ATACMS missiles. Administration initially said no, no nuclear war occurred. In almost every one of these cases, Russia threatened to escalation and attack on NATO or the use of nuclear weapons. Each time the bluff was called and Ukraine was able to better defend its territory. While Russia's threats should not be taken lightly, history shows us that these threats are often hollow. Very true. The threat is often worse than the action, and they know that, and they keep using those threats. Imagine if we had provided Ukraine with all of the above weapons from the start. After the 2022 counteroffensive, Russia was on the defensive, disorganized, demoralized, and struggling to recruit more troops. Ukraine might have finished the fight. Just imagine that. Like, that's how history could have gone. There are those who say that the Biden administration's careful calibration has allowed the U.S. to give increasing amounts of firepower to Ukraine without triggering Russian tripwires. But this isn't how war works. The idea that Russia would use nukes has been shown not to be a real concern. So why wait? Why delay while Ukrainians continue to lose their lives? That's a good question. We understood the prohibition on attacks on Russian soil when Ukraine was struggling to defend Kyiv. It didn't make sense to waste efforts on revenge strikes. However, once the war entered the attrition phase, it became utter nonsense to keep this prohibition alive. Of course, escalation management is important, and support for Ukraine or any ally should not come with blinders. The U.S., in providing lethal aid, deserves a seat at the table and input on how the aid should be used. However, when faced with an existential crisis, much latitude should be given to Ukraine. That's right. In giving the aid, we do have a say. But really, are we really the ones that have the greatest burden here? Let the Ukrainians use it. We have heard Ukrainian soldiers repeatedly tell stories of Russian columns attacking, being repelled, retreating to safe Russian territory to regroup, to have a hot meal, plan an attack again. Ukraine cannot win if Russians can attack civilian targets with impunity and call a timeout in their own territory. That's exactly right. Ukraine has been prevented from attacking legitimate military targets because of a paralyzing fear of escalation, despite the law of armed conflict giving Ukraine the right to defend itself in such a way. The Biden administration deserves credit for its actions in Ukraine, especially given the alternative of President Donald Trump's threatening to abandon the country. However, the fear of escalation, while noble, is actually making victory for Ukraine less likely. But again, that's just been mitigated, at least to some degree, by Biden's decision today, just 2 hours ago, to allow limited strikes within Russia. All right, so that's where we are. Thank you for the time. Here's just want to leave you with a couple last things. So this is Tanked Putin. Tanked Putin is a parody site. It's kind of like Darth Putin. So now I'm saying Zelensky were legitimate president, but not any longer because he's following Ukrainian constitution. Now, there is some of this where people like Che Bowes of RT will be saying, he's an illegitimate president, he's a dictator, he's not even elected. Right, okay, I get it. I thought we were saying that he's illegitimate from the start because of a CIA coup. I'm starting to confuse myself. Okay, and last thing, let's go and check to see if there's any movement on the Trump verdict and see what has happened. This is real time as far as I am. Donald Trump is found guilty of all 34 counts of falsifying business records related to 2016 hush money payments to Stormy Daniels. Wow, we have to see, so there's 4 big stories now. We have to see in follow-up, and I'll probably do an entire video about what has just happened here. That is amazing that he's found guilty on all these counts, and what will that mean? Now, my guess is that's going to be he will appeal that, and as long as he can in order to get to the presidency, and then he could theoretically pardon himself, as far as I understand. And I can't remember any place, and I did my doctoral dissertation on the Constitutional Convention. I can't remember any place where the founding fathers, in discussing that, were saying, well, he might be able to, what if a president could pardon himself? And they would say, no, that's, they didn't talk about that, at least not to my recollection. So this is big news. Okay, that's it. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the like, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.